The snowstorm was strong and cold outside. The winds are hitting David's walls hard. A former firefighter sat inside a cabin. In his living room, there was a warm light. The flame creates flickering shadows. The storm was visible from across the room. He was alone for days, and it was quiet, was only interrupted by an odd crack. A noise came from the logs in the fire, pierced the stillness. A faint, desperate. David frowned and set down his scratcher. Mug of coffee, he listened carefully. And then, it was again, this time accompanied by a faint whimper. He stood. His heart started to race. The sound was coming from the front door. Walking cautiously toward the entrance, David's eyes widened as he approached the glass door, there framed against the drifting snow stood a German shepherd, her body shaking from the cold pressed tightly against her. Were two tiny puppies, barely noticeable, beneath her defensive stance. Frost clung to her fur, and her breath came out unseen puffs as she gazed at David with eyes full of despair. David froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He knew opening the door could mean bringing trouble into his home. But Asher's gaze met his. Something deep within him stirred. The choice he was about to make would change their lives forever. David's heart pounded as he stood frozen in front of the door. The storm raged. Behind the frightened German shepherd, her breath fogging up the frosted glass, her body was hunched over, protecting the two tiny pups that clung to her side there. Their small bodies were almost buried under the snow gathering around them. David could see her ribs pressing through her fur, her coat matted with ice, and here he's pleading, desperate and filled with a mix of fear and hope, locked onto his, "What the hell happened to you?" David whispered to himself, his breath missing. The cold air inside the room. Automatically he reached for the doorknob the moment the door creaked open. The icy wind surged into the cabin, carrying the storm's harsh chill. The German shepherd didn't move. Her paws still planted firmly in the snow. She stayed frozen in place, her gaze fixed on David, as if unsure whether to trust him. "Come on, girl, get in here," David coaxed, bending down to make himself less scary. "You'll freeze to death out there," the dog let out a soft whimper, looking briefly at her pups before stepping forward, her moves slow and cautious. She nudged one of the pups with her nose, telling them to follow. The smaller of the two stumbled in the snow, its tiny legs straining to keep up. Without hesitation, the mother gently picked it up by the scruff and carried it inside, followed closely by the second pup. As soon as they were inside, David shut the door behind them, shutting out the storm's relentless roar. The sudden warmth of the house caused the German shepherd to tremble more violently, her body reacting to the temperature shift. David grabbed an old blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her and the pups. She flinched at first, but when she realized he wasn't going to hurt her, she let out a long, shaky sigh and lay down near the fire, curling protectively around her puppies. David knelt beside her, his mind racing. The pups were tiny, their eyes barely open, and they were so frail that he could see their little chests rise and fall. With strained breaths, he ached out to touch one, but the mother's low growl stopped him. It was bold, just a warning, a reminder that she was still afraid of him. "All right. All right," David muttered, raising his hands in surrender. "I get it. You're a good Mom. You've been through hell, haven't you?" He stood and grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, filling it with warm water, placing it near the dog. He stepped back, giving her space. She eyed him wearily, but finally leaned forward, lapping at the water as her pups huddled closer to her side. David watched from a distance, his thoughts spinning. Where had she come from? How had she ended up in the middle of a storm with two newborns? Her state suggested she had been on her own for a while, long enough to grow weak and desperate, but not enough to give up the fact that she had made it this far. Carrying her pups through the storm was nothing short of a miracle. But now David wasn't prepared for this. He had always been a dog lover, but his life had taken a quieter Done in retirement, he hadn't had a pet in years, and the idea of caring for 3 dogs, especially ones in such dire need, was overwhelming still as he looked at the mother's tired frame. And the way she curled protectively around her pups, he knew he couldn't turn them away. "You've got a fighter spirit. I'll give you that." David said, his voice soft. "Guess that makes 2 of us," as the night wore on. David worked to make them more comfortable. He laid out towels for the pups, put a bowl of food near them, and stoked the fire to keep the room warm. The German Shepherd watched him closely, her eyes tracking his every move. But as the hours passed, her posture began to relax for the first time. She let her head rest on the blanket, her eyes flapping shut. David sat in his chair, the fire crackling softly beside him, and couldn't help but feel a strange sense of goal. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for now he had done what he could. And as the storm raged on outside, he made a silent promise to them, other and her pups. They were safe, and he wouldn't let anything happen to them. The next morning, David awoke to the faint sound of soft whimpers and the crackling fire that had burned. During the night the storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of snow that glistened in the early morning sunlight he rubbed. His eyes, his mind immediately shifting to the surprise guests who had sought refuge in his home, heading toward the fireplace. He saw the German Shepherd still curled around her pups. The pups stirred slightly, their tiny bodies wriggling under her protective hug. The mother's ears twitched at the sound of David's moves, and her amber eyes opened, locking onto his. There was still a guarded look in her gaze, but it lacked the despair of the night before morning girl. David said gently as he stretched and walked toward the kitchen. "Let's see if we can get you something to eat." He rummaged through his pantry, grabbing a can of chicken. Soup it wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. David warmed it up on the stove and carefully put a bowl near her. She lifted her head, sniffing the air carefully, and after a moment began to eat the pups, feeling their mother's movement let out small cries and tried to nuzzle closer to her warmth. David knelt down a few feet away, watching as she ate. "You're a tough one," he said softly, "carrying those little ones through that storm. You deserve better than this." As the morning wore on, David took stock of their condition. The mother was clearly malnourished, her ribs stark against her thin frame. The pups, while weak, seemed to have enough fight in them to try to nurse, their tiny tails wagging slightly as they latched onto their mother. David's heart ached. At the sight, he had seen his share of suffering during his years as a fireman, but there was something uniquely heartbreaking about the quiet fight of these animals choosing to help. Further, David made a quick call to the nearest veterinary center. "Hey, this is David Carter," he said when their receptionist answered. "I've got a German Shepherd and her 2 pups here. They're in bad shape. Think you could take a look at them?" The receptionist's voice was warm but firm. "Of course, Mr. Carter, we can squeeze you in this afternoon. Bring them over and we'll do what we can." David hung up, pleased. He glanced at the German Shepherd, who was now licking her pups affectionately, her maternal feelings shining through, despite her exhaust question. "You hear that, girl? We're going to get you some help." Getting them to Thevet proved to be no small job. David found an old blanket and gently tried to coax the mother onto it. She hesitated, her body tense, and let out a soft growl when David moved too close to her pups. "It's okay," he comforted her, keeping his actions slow. "I'm not going to hurt them, I promise." After several minutes of gentle coaxing, she finally allowed him to lift her and the pups into the back of his truck. David secured the blanket carefully, making sure they were comfortable before driving toward town. The roads were still icy from the storm, and David drove carefully, his mind running with questions. Where had she come from? Was someone out there missing here? Or had she been abandoned, left to fend for herself? In the brutal cold at the vet office, the staff moved quickly, their practiced hands inspecting the mother and pups. "She's terribly underweight," the vet Dr. Monroe said as she ran her hands along the dog's thin frame. "But she's strong. Her pups are lucky. She made it this far. Dr. Monroe glanced at David, her expression thoughtful. She's been through a lot. It'll take time for her to fully recover, but with proper care she'll be okay. Do you know where she came from? David shook his head. She just showed up at my door last night. I couldn't leave her out there. The vet smiled softly. Well, she chose the right door. By the time David brought them back home, the mother seemed calmer. The pups, now full from their meal at the clinic, wriggled happily as they nestled back into her side. David sat nearby, watching as the German Shepherd finally allowed herself to relax. She even let him sit closer, her eyes relaxing when he reached out to gently stroke her head. "You're safe now." David whispered, his voice thick with feelings. "I don't know what you've been through, but you've got a place here. As long as you need it." For the first time, the German Shepherd leaned into his her body, no longer rigid with fear. David felt a lump rise in his throat. He had opened the door for her out of gut, not knowing what would come of it. But now, seeing her trust starting to grow, he realized that they had both found something that had been missing, a sense of purpose and perhaps a second chance. The days that followed brought a steady rhythm of health and trust. The German Shepherd, who David had started calling. Grace was slowly regaining her strength. Her once sunken eyes began to sheen with a flicker of life, and the pups, whom he had named Snow and Ash, grew more busy with each passing day. David spent hours sitting on the floor near the fireplace, letting Grace grow adapted to his presence. At first she would watch him with careful eyes, her body tight and protective, but little by little, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. She allowed him to sit closer, her growls softening into occasional sighs, and eventually she even let him pet her without flinching. One night, as the wind howled outside, David sat on the floor, his back against the couch, watching the fire dance in the hearth. Grace lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, while Snow and Ash tumbled drolly over each other, their tiny tails wagging. David couldn't help but smile at their antics. "You've got some tough little ones there, Grace," he said, softly glancing at her. She lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes full of something David could only describe as gratitude. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing her head. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her body finally relaxing as the days turned into weeks. Grace's change was undeniable. Her coat, dull and thin, began to shine with health. Her ribs were no longer as visible, and her energy returned in bursts. She played with her pups, nudging them with her nose and watching them stumble around the house with tiny barks of excitement. David, too, found himself changing. For years, he had lived alone in the house, content with the quiet solitude of his retirement. But Grace and her pups had brought a new kind of life into his world. The once silent nights were now filled with the sound of light-hearted yips and the soft padding of paws against the wooden floor. He hadn't realized how much he had missed, having a sense of purpose. Until now, one afternoon, as David chopped wood outside, he noticed Grace looking at the window, her nose pressed against the glass. Snow and Ash were playing near her feet, their tiny bodies falling over each other. David paused, wiping sweat from his face, and waved at her. To his surprise, Grace wagged her tail just once, but it was enough to make his heart swell when he turned. Inside, Grace greeted him at the door, her tail moving slightly as she nudged his hand with her nose. It was the first time she had approached him willingly, and David couldn't hide the grin spreading across his face. "Well, aren't you full of shocks today?" He laughed, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. Grace leaned into him, her tail wiggling more enthusiastically now. Snow and Ash barked happily, circling around his legs in excitement as their bond grew stronger. David began to wonder about Grace's past. Where had she come from? What had led her to his door that snowy night? The question stayed in his mind, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever her story was, it was one of life and resilience. Grace had faced the worst of situations and had emerged. With her pups by her side, she was a fighter through and through that night as they all settled by the fire. David looked at Grace and spoke softly. "I don't know where you came from, girl, but I'm glad you found me. You and this little one's your part of the family." Now Grace lifted her head, her eyes meeting his as there was something in her gaze, a quiet understanding, a bond that needed no words. She let out a soft sigh and rested her head on his lap, her body completely at ease for the first time since she'd arrived. David felt a lump rise in his throat as he stroked her fur. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the coming of a stray dog and her pups to change his life so profoundly. But as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the soft sounds of Grace and her pups, he realized that they had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing: companionship, goal, and a renewed feeling of hope. Chapter 4. Shadows of the past. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's windows, casting golden beams across the floor, where snow and ash playfully fell over one another. Grace lay nearby, her eyes half closed as she rested, but her ears perked at every small sound. David standing by the kitchen bar sipped his coffee and watched them with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years, but as quiet as things seemed. A lingering question nodded at the edges of David's mind. Where had Grace come from? She bore the signs of a hard life, her thin frame, the tiny scars along her coat, the cautious way she moved when shocked. Someone had failed her, and David couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was might still be out there. That afternoon, David chose to take Grace and the pups. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, showing patches of frozen ground beneath. Grace stepped cautiously onto the porch, smelling the air as if testing for danger. The pups still wobbly on, their feet followed close behind, yipping excitement as they explored the new world beyond the house. David smiled, watching them. "You're safe now, girl," he said softly. "Nothing's going to hurt you here." But as they went a little farther from the cabin, Grace suddenly froze. Her ears shot up, her body tensing as her nose pointed toward the edge of the woods. David followed her gaze, his own body stiffening. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer to her. Grace let out a low growl, her hackles rising. David squinted into the trees, but he saw nothing still. The way Grace's body was positioned, protective, ready to defend, told him everything he needed to know. Something was out there, he quickly gathered, the pups cradling them in his arms, as he guided Grace back toward the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and pulled the curtain, shut, his heart running. Grace continued to pace by the window, her eyes darting toward the woods. Later that evening, as David sat by the fire, he couldn't shake the dread that had settled over him. Grace lay nearby, her pups cuddled against her side, but she remained alert, her eyes moving toward the door at every sound. David reached out and gently scratched behind her ears. "You're not just being anxious, are you?" he murmured. "You've seen something like this before." His thoughts drifted as hasted into the flames. He couldn't imagine what Grace had been through to make her so wary. Had she been abandoned, hurt? David clenched his hands at the thought whoever had done this to her had no right to call themselves people. The next day, David decided to get answers. He put Grace and the pups into his truck and drove into town. The neighborhood animals shelter was small but well-run, staffed by amateurs who knew most of the animals in the area. David approached the front desk, carrying a picture he had taken of Grace and her pups. "I found here, outside my cell," he explained to Theophis, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, named Sarah. "I was thinking, if Anyone's reported her lost, or if you recognize her." Sarah studied the picture for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't know her," she said. "But dogs like her, we see them more often than we'd like. A lot of parents out here keep dogs in terrible situations. When they're no longer useful, they just abandon them." David felt a surge of anger boil within him. "You mean to tell me she was probably dumped?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "It happens more than you think, but she's lucky she found you the drive back to the cabin." was heavy with silence. David couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said. Grace had been thrown away, like she didn't matter, but she did matter to her pups, to him, and now he was determined to make sure she never felt unloved again when they got home. Grace stepped out of the truck and immediately began smelling there, her tail moving slightly. Snow and Ash followed their little legs, working hard to keep up. David watched them, his heart rising with both anger and hope. "You're safe now," he said, firmly looking at Grace. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Grace turned to him, her amber eyes softening. For the first time, David felt that she truly understood what he was saying. And in that moment, he made a quiet vow whoever had hurt her would never get the chance to do it again. The following days passed in an uncomfortable calm. Grace seemed to relax a little more each day, her faith in David growing stronger. Snow and Ash had begun to explore the cabin, with boundless wonder filling the quiet area with their playful barks and tumbles. Yet despite the warmth and safety inside, David couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. It was late one evening when his unease was proven. David was sitting by the window, absently stroking Grace's fur as Snow and Ash dozed. By the fire, the moonlight lit the snow-covered ground outside, casting long shadows across the yard. That's when he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. David's heart stopped. He leaned closer to the window, trying to make out the shape. The person was tall, cloaked in darkness, but unmistakably human. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. "Grace." David muttered, his voice low. The German shepherd's ears perked up, and she followed his gaze the moment her eyes locked on the figure. She let out a deep, deep growl, her body tensing as she stood protectively in front of Snow and Ash. David quickly drew the curtains and grabbed his phone, dialing the local sheriff. "This is David Carter," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's someone outside my house. I don't know who, but they've been standing at the edge of the woods for a while now." The dispatcher promised him that a deputy would be sent to check the area, but David's grip on the phone tightened. Something about this felt wrong too, intentional too. Personal minutes felt like hours, as David waited for the deputy to arrive. Grace stayed by the door, her growls low and steady, while David paced the room, looking nervously at the window. Finally, headlights pierced through the darkness, and David breathed in relief as the deputy's car pulled into the driveway. Deputy Miller, a tall, no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, stepped out of the car. David met her at the door, telling what he had seen. It wasn't just a random passerby. He said firmly, "They were watching us." Miller nodded, her hand resting on the holster of her flashlight. "I'll take a look around. Stay inside and keep your doors locked." David nodded, his gut twisting as he watched her disappear into the woods, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the trees. He stood by the window, his hands clenched into fists as he waited. Grace sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the same spot, her body twisted with tension. When Miller returned, her face was grim. "There's no one out there now," she said, "but I did find tracks going up to the edge of your property. Whoever it was, they were definitely watching in the house." David swallowed hard. "Did you find anything else?" Miller hesitated. "There was a piece of rope tied to one of the trees. It's old, but it looked like it had been used recently. My guess is someone's been using the woods as a camp." The thought sent a chill down David's spine. "Do you think they'll come back?" "I can't say for sure," Miller answered, "but I'll have guards circle this area more frequently. If you see anything else, call us." Soon after the deputy left, the cabin felt heavy than ever. David locked every door and window, his mind running with questions. Who was out there, and why were they so interested in the cabin and Grace? As he settled into the armchair, Grace came to him, pressing her head against his knee. He reached down and stroked her fur, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry, girl. I won't let anyone hurt you or those pups." Grace let out a soft whine, her amber eyes meeting his for the first time since she had arrived. David saw something in her gaze that he hadn't noticed before, fear mixed with recognition. She knew something about the person in the woods, and whatever it was, it scared her that night. Sleep didn't come easily for David. He stayed by the window, his rifle lying against the wall beside him, ready for anything. Grace lay at his feet, her ears moving at every sound. Snow and ash snuggled together by the fire. Bliss, fully unaware of the danger waiting just beyond. The trees. As the hours ticked by, David made a quiet vow, no matter what or who came. For them, he would protect Grace and her pups at any cost. They were his family now, and he wasn't about to let their second chance be taken away. The first rays of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the curtains, leaving a faint light across the cabin. David had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the shadowy person in the woods. Grace stayed close to him throughout the night, her body tense and alert, while Snow and Ash slept soundly near the fire, unaware to the unease in the air. David was about to pour himself another cup of coffee when Grace suddenly bolted to the front door, her ears perked and a low growl rumbling from her chest. David froze, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. He grabbed his gun from the corner and slowly approached the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. His stomach dropped. The figure was back, standing closer this time, just beyond the edge of the porch. "Damn it," David muttered under his breath. He tightened his grip on the gun and turned to Grace. "Stay here," he said firmly, though he knew she wouldn't listen, opening the door just a crack. David stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching against the frost. "Covered wood, who's out there?" he called, his voice calm, despite the fear eating at him. "This is private property." The figure didn't move at first, but then it took a step forward, showing a man in his 40s, his face hidden by the hood of a torn davide. He carried a rope in one hand and a smirk on his face. "That's my dog," the man said, his voice calm but filled with menace. "I've been looking for her." David's blood ran cold. "Your dog?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "She showed up at my door half dead with 2 pups. If she's yours, why the hell did she look like that?" The man shrugged, taking another step closer. "She got out, happens sometimes, but I'm here to take her back." David raised his gun slightly, the barrel pointing straight at the man's chest. "You're not taking her anywhere. She's not yours anymore." The man's smirk faltered and he stopped in his sounds. "You don't know what you're dealing with, old man. That dog's trouble. She's better off with me." David's grip on the gun tightened. "No, she's better off with someone who actually gives a damn. Now get off my property." At that moment, Grace appeared in the doorway, her body rigid and her teeth bared. She let out a deep, wild growl that echoed through the cold morning air. The man's smirk vanished, completely replaced by a flicker of fear. "Grace, get back," David ordered, but she didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the man. And for the first time, David realized just how much she remembered. This wasn't a stranger to her. This was someone she had escaped from, someone who had hurt her and her pups. The man took a step back, the rope falling from his hand. "You've made a mistake, old man," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't know what that dog's capable of." David took a step forward, his gun still raised. "The only mistake was you thinking you could come back here and take her. She's not going anywhere, and neither are her pups now. Get off my land before I make you regret it." The man paused for a moment, his eyes flicking between David and Grace, before finally turning and leaving into the woods. David watched him until he disappeared from sight, the stress in his shoulders slowly easing back inside. David bolted the door and crouched down beside Grace, who was still standing guard. "He's gone," he said, softly stroking her head. "You did good, girl. You kept us safe." Grace let out a shaky breath, her body finally relaxing as she nuzzled into David's hand. Snow and Ash stirred by the fire, their small yips breaking the silence. David scooped them up and placed them beside Grace, watching as she curled protectively around them that night as the fire crackled in the hearth. David sat with Grace and her pups by his side. He knew the man might come back, but he also knew that Grace wouldn't run this time. She had found her home, her family, and to courage, and David in turn had found something he hadn't known he was, losing a reason to fight, to protect and to love for the first time in years. David felt truly alive together. He and Grace had faced the darkness, and together they would face whatever came next. Grace's journey from a cold doorstep to a warm home was nothing short of amazing her resilience. The bond she formed with David and her steadfast devotion to her pups showed the changing power of love and trust. Together they faced danger and overcame the shadows of Grace's past, proving that even in the darkest time, shop can prevail. Stories like Grace's remind us of the incredible bravery animals show and the powerful impact they can have on our lives. If this story touched your heart, let it inspire you to take action. Consider adopting, helping a nearby shelter, or simply sharing this movie to spread awareness. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves stories of courage and second chances. Together we can make a change, one rescue at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey.